every sewer, we should have a little bit of fancy in our back pocket. So today, I'm going to talk about a few fancy things that are pretty simple to achieve on just about any machine. So if you're ready for a little bit of fancy, I know I am. I'm Cathy, and this is Sewing Tech Talk. So we have a very special giveaway today. We have a genuine imitation diamond necklace with a sewing theme. It's a little sewing machine on a chain. Wear it proudly whenever you want to be fancy. Every time you like, share, or comment, you're entered for a chance to win this gorgeous piece of jewelry. So every sewer really should have a few fancy techniques. Now some fancy techniques, they don't take much. They're just like regular sewing. You might just change the needle or thread or a foot. So I have a few I'd like to share with you today. I'm going to be making a nightgown, and I'm trying out some fancy techniques, which I recommend you do, to see if I want to put them in my garment. So we have the Wheel of Fancy. Let's spin the Wheel of Fancy and see which technique we're going to start out first. Let's start out with a French seam. It's pretty simple. Now a French seam, unlike a regular seam, you start out with the wrong sides of the fabric together. You sew along that edge, you trim it, turn it to the right side, sew the seam as you would, but those edges are beautifully tailored and finished inside. It's a great sturdy seam that's beautifully finished on the inside. So we're going to use a straight stitch. I'm going to use the straight stitch with the center needle position, and we're using the Baby Lock Vesta today. So let me show you how I have that stitch set up. It's just the basic stitch when the machine comes up. I have the stitch with the center needle position, and I'm going to sew a 3/8 inch seam with this fabric right sides together. Let me show you on the machine basically where the guide is for that. Now here on the Vesta, if you look at the needle plate cover, the bobbin cover right here, it has a center line, 1/4 inch, and just to the right of that would be 3/8 of an inch. I could take my measuring device and see exactly where that would be. And it's basically just the side of that 4 right there. So I'm going to put my fabric underneath the presser foot, and I'm going to sew my 3/8 inch seam. Yep, that's just about right. Turns out it's just about right here. Good thing I measured, right? So now, let's stitch this seam with the right sides out and the wrong sides together. So I've used a fine thread. Now I'm going to turn this to the right side, but I'm going to do a couple things first. I'm going to go over and I'm going to press it, and I'm going to show you that when I press it, I'm going to trim it and then press it so that when I turn it to the right side, I don't have any threads sticking out from the edge. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come and I'm going to trim off this edge right here, and I'm going to trim it down to 1/8 of an inch, which is really small. Now, why didn't I sew it that way from the very beginning? Well, it's challenging to sew that close to the edge. I found in doing precision work that sometimes it's better to sew it big and then cut it down a little bit smaller. So let me cut this edge, and I'll do part of it so that you can see how that works. Oops. The Wheel of Fancy keeps turning. All right. So I've trimmed my edge to 1/8 of an inch. Now I'm going to press it with my mighty little iron. So here's my iron, and I'm going to press it a couple ways, and you might think this is overkill, but it's really not. So I'm going to press it flat. That takes that round seam and makes it flat. Now I'm going to press it so that the seam is open. So let's take this and we'll open up the seam, and then sometimes pressing a seam open is a little bit challenging. So here we go. We'll take the tip of the iron and we'll come right along there. And we pressed that seam open. Why did I do that? Well, now I'm going to fold it upon itself and press it so that that seam is together. Because I pressed it open, this will fold easier and that stitching will be right along the edge. I know it seems counterintuitive, but it really works. So that came out really nice. Now I'm going to go back over to my same straight stitch and I'm going to stitch a 1/2 inch seam, and that small little 1/8 of an inch is going to be caught right in that seam, and it's going to be an absolutely beautiful seam. So now I'm over here. I'm going to stitch it so that it's about a 1/2 an inch over. I can use the guide on the front of the foot if I want to. If I want to get a seam guide, I could use that. Oops! I needed to thread my needle. Good thing it's real fast on the Vesta. There we go. So there's my seam. Look how beautiful that French seam is. So when I open it up, there it is on the right side, and there it is on the inside. Now, I could make this much tinier if I wanted to. And on a sheer fabric, this looks beautiful if this is a tiny little seam. You're just going to take all the different dimensions of the seam allowances I talked about and make them a little bit smaller. Maybe you trim it to a 1/16 of an inch. It just depends. So experiment with that. That's a pretty easy seam that you can insert into whatever you want to do. Now I have a handout that talks about all these different fancy techniques that I'm going to be doing, and it has a listing of the stitch settings that I'm using and the stitches I'm using in the Vesta, and pictures so that you can find out these settings on your machine. So that's the very first one. We're going to spin the wheel of fancy again and see what we get. Let's try putting in some lace. What do you say? So, I wanted this to be a very inexpensive way for you to try out some fun stuff. You can spend a lot of money on lace. Ask me how I know. But I'm just using some basic lace trim seam binding. And it actually, it works really, really good. I've made some garments and nightgowns and put it in there and it lasts forever. So let's put some lace in the middle of some fabric. So here's a lace insertion, and it's pretty simple to do. What I'm going to do is I'm first going to take the lace and I'm going to sew it down to the fabric, and then I'm going to use a fancy stitch to stitch it down. So let me take my mighty scissors here. I'm going to get my iron out of the way so I don't burn myself, because I will if I can. Let's cut off a piece of lace. Now this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to stitch the lace on either side with just the same straight stitch that I used. Then I'm going to trim the back, pull each side over to the back, and do a fancier stitch on either side. Now you can use a traditional thread like I have in the machine. In the machine right now I have a very thin thread. I have some Quilter's Select thread, which I think gives a really elegant result. But you could also use a much thicker thread if you wanted to. This is a Decora 12, and I've used it on this side, and I've used the same stitch. It just gives you a bigger look. So let's go to the machine now, and I'm going to stitch this down. The settings are the same. I haven't changed any of the settings on the machine. I'm simply going to take the fabric, lay it exactly where I want to stitch it, and I'm going to stitch it on either side. Now this is kind of a cool technique for putting in lace, because you're not changing the dimension of the fabric that you might be cutting out. So for example, I'm not cutting the fabric and then attaching it to the lace. I'm going to end up with the same width of fabric I started out with, because I'm simply stitching the lace to the top of it. So let's put that lace right under the needle, and I'm just going to stitch a straight stitch down either side. You might want to pin the lace if it's a big piece of lace that you're going to use. Now all I need to do is stitch the other side. Now I've just stitched on either side. Now I'm going to take my applique scissors, and I'm using the Quilter Select Wave Applique because they have a really nice sharp serrated edge, and I'm just going to cut down the middle, but I'm not going to cut my lace. So let's just insert the scissors in the middle, trim my fabric, making sure not to cut the lace. And now I'm just going to pull that fabric to either side. It's a good idea to give it a press. You can also use Best Press 2. Now Best Press 2 adds a little bit of body to the fabric, and if you're going to be doing a decorative stitch on either side, then it's a great way to give that fabric just a little bit extra body. You can always add a lightweight tearaway stabilizer too. Now I've set up the machine, and I've told myself on my sample that I have used stitch 220. So I'm going to go to that stitch on the machine. It's a good idea to write down your information on your samples. So I'm going to go to stitch 220. And it's told me that my settings are 3.0 on the width and 2.5 on the length. Okay. Now, I have this stitch, and it's going to be, the cool thing about the Vesta is what you see is what you get. So I really like that. That little stitch is going to go right along this edge. I'm going to stitch here, and it's going to swing over to the left and catch that lace. Let's see how I do. Now, I think that's a little bit of fancy that anybody can get behind. It was pretty simple. I just sewed a straight stitch on either side, made a cut, turned my fabric to the back, and I think that looks pretty elegant with a pretty inexpensive piece of trim. So this could be added even to a knit garment. It could be added to an existing garment. Adding a piece of lace can be pretty simple. So we've had two techniques so far. I think we need to go back to the Wheel of Fancy and spin and see if there's some other trouble that we can get into. Let's spin the Wheel of Fancy. Let's try to do something with a cord. Now a cord can be put on the edge of fabric. Here's my piece of fabric right now. Here's my fabric, and here's the edge, just a plain old folded edge. Now I have turned this under and slipped a piece of stabilizer inside of it. It's just a medium weight tearaway stabilizer. But what makes this fancy is you can sew a cord right along the outside edge. That's pretty sweet. It gives you a super crisp edge. Now, what if you're doing a garment? This could be the edge of the pocket. What if you're a quilter? Couldn't this be a pretty nice binding when it comes over to the other side? And if this was a different color, it would add just a sweet little touch of just a little tiny mini piping to the edge of your binding if you're a quilter. So let's do a corded edge. So now, all a corded edge is a piece of thicker thread. I'm going to be using a Decora thread, and this is a thicker weight Decora thread, and you can see that thread is going to have a little bit of beef to it. I could use something thicker if I wanted to. One thing that you can also do is you can take some regular thread. This is just regular old thread, and I've twisted it to create a super twisted thicker cord. This is just regular thread that I've twisted. So if you need to match something and you don't have a thicker cord, you can totally do that. So this foot is the cording foot, because we're going to be sewing with cord. So what I do is I take my thread and I thread it through one of the holes of the cord. Well, you can probably see that this thick thread, it probably doesn't want to go through. I could be struggling for days. So here is my trick. It's a floss threader. So you can pick these up just about any big box store. You take your threader, you stick it in your opening of choice, take your thread, stick it through the floss threader. Big old opening right there. Easier said than done. Imagine I'm trying to get through this little hole of the foot. That would never happen. There it is. Whoops. Slick stuff. Whoops. It's going to take less time to sew it than it is to get it into the foot. Here we go. Quickly before it escapes. Here we go. All right. So now I have loaded the foot up with some cord. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick just a basic zigzag stitch, and I'm going to stitch over the edge of that cord while it's laying right next to the edge of the fabric. Pretty simple. So before we sew it, we're going to get ready to sew it. Let's go to the screen and let's set up that stitch. Now I've made myself a note, and my note says I'm using stitch 110, 110, which is your basic zigzag stitch, and I've told the machine myself I want a width of 2.5 and a length of 1.0. Now I'll tell you one reason I really like the Baby Lock Vesta is I can see my stitch. Now let me increase it so that you can see the width of that. Oops, I need to pick the stitch. Now we'll see it. Now we're going to take it down to 2.5 and a length of 1.0. That's what it looks like. So on the Vesta, what you see is what you get, which is pretty cool, right? Okay, now let's stitch this bad boy out. So we're going to come to this machine. We're going to put this foot on the machine. Make sure that cord doesn't escape me again. Here we go. Now, it's pretty simple. I'm simply going to put the foot right next to the edge of the cord, and I'm going to make sure that when that needle sews, that when it swings to the right, that it's going to go over the outside edge of that cord and then come on the inside. So let's see if we need to do some adjustments on the screen, which we might need to do. So I can see that in the position that it is now, it's just catching that folded edge. No worries. The Baby Lock Vesta has a unique feature called left-right shift. Let me go back to the screen. Here's the left-right shift, and that means I can take a zigzag and I can move the whole zigzag over to the right. By punching this over here, I can move the whole zigzag over so that it's now in the perfect, precise position for me to catch this cord. Now I can use the same setup that I have, but I've shifted the whole zigzag over to the right, and it's going to catch that edge perfectly. Now it's just basic sewing. The foot's going to hold the cord in the perfect position, and as I stitch, it's simply going to be zigzagged over the edge. Don't know if you can see, but that turned out pretty cool. It gives you a nice crisp edge on that outside. Now I do have a handout, like I said, and it shows you all the settings that I've set the machine up for, and it has pictures of all the finished stitches up close and in detail. So if you didn't catch it on the video, didn't take notes, no problem. So basically, after I finish doing that, I come on in and I trim that inside edge. Now, I do like this stitch quite a bit. So I am using this stitch for the edge of the ruffle on my nightgown. So let me show you how that looks. I've done it on the edge of my nightgown, and there's yards and yards and yards of ruffle on here. So it gives me a nice finished edge that I can use on the edge of my ruffle. And it was pretty simple to do. Remember, it could be a bigger cord if you wanted to. Don't have to have the foot, but it makes it much easier. Are you ready to spin the wheel of fancy again? Well, here we go. I know. Let's go and let's do some tucks. Now, I can use my regular foot for this. I could also use an open toe foot if I wanted to, because I'm going to do basically the same idea, but I'm not going to use the cord. I'm going to set up my stitch, there's my settings now, and I'm going to stitch along the edge of my fabric, and the needle's going to swing over, but I want to swing on the outside edge of my fabric. Now what it's going to do, I'm going to adjust the tension so it pulls that fabric in. So let's set up the machine before we start to sew. So here we are. I know what my stitch is and my settings. Maybe I'll punch the number this time. So we'll go here. Okay. I want stitch 115. Now remember, you have to touch it to bring it up. What you see is what you get. So now let's adjust it. I want a width of 5.0. Notice how the machine is showing me the stitch as it modifies it. I want a length of 4.5. That really spaced it out, didn't it? Now, I want to change the tension. The Baby Lock Vesta has automatic tensions, but I can adjust them if I want to. Now, I want it to really pull in this fabric, so I'm going to go to the max tension setting that I can, and that's a 9.0. Now, this actually also works great on knits, on the edge of knits. It's a nice little finish for that. Okay, so now let's stitch it out. So here I am. I'm going to put my regular presser foot on. Remember, this is just a stitch we've selected and we've modified. I'm going to stitch along the edge, and I'm going to want the fabric, the needle, to swing and catch just that folded edge. And I can use the guides on the seam guides on my bobbin cover if I want to. Actually, I could also put some sort of a guide here to help me if I'm going to do yards and yards of this. Now, if the machine's going too fast for me, if I have to slow sew, what I can do is I can do the speed dial on the top of the machine, and that'll slow the top speed of the machine down. Oh, that's a little bit too slow. That's a little bit better. Would you look at how pretty that is? Now, I could do yards and yards and yards of that, and I think I might do that on the other part of my ruffle for my nightgown. You can see you just changed a stitch and you modified it, and it's pretty fancy. You didn't do that much. Let's spin the wheel of fancy again. See if we can get a little bit fancier. Oh, yes we can. I know what we'll do. We'll use a wing needle. Now, a wing needle is something you may have never stitched with before. It's pretty different than any other needle you've probably ever seen. Now, I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to put it up against the fabric so that you can see it. There it is. It's not like your regular needle. It's like your regular needle with wings on either side. And it's designed to make an extra large hole. We want an extra large hole because it's going to make the fabric look like it's kind of like lace. So we need to change our needle for this one, and we need to have a piece of fabric with, I've used a piece of tearaway stabilizer on the back. Your fabric may or may not need that for the stitch that you're going to choose. So just experiment like I'm doing with little samples. So let's set up the machine, and then what we'll do is we're going to stitch it out. Let's do the settings of the machine. Now I gave myself settings. I'm going to use the wing needle, and I'm going to now go into the land of heirloom stitches. So that's category 3 on the Vesta. And I want stitch 306, which is the star stitch. Now when you're using a wing needle, what you really want is the needle to pierce that same hole multiple times. In your handout, I show you a bunch of stitches that's going to work for this, and their fancy names. So I don't have any other modifications. I just needed that stitch. Another one that I could use, let me show you while I'm here, is I could use stitch 308. I think that's called the Venetian stitch. But we're going to stick with the star stitch with no modifications. But we do need to change our needle. Now, Baby Lock Vesta has an awesome needle threader, but this needle is a little bit different. So for this needle, I'm just going to thread the needle myself, but I do want to show you a trick. So here's my thread. Oops, here's my thread. Little tiny thread. There it is. There's my thread. And what I want to do is I need to thread this needle. Now a lot of people will lick the end of their thread and then try to thread the needle, but actually you can still give it a lick. Put your hand behind the needle and that moisture lubricates the eye of the needle. And the thread just seems to find that eye really, really easy and go right on in. And if you have a vision issue, take your glasses off so that you can see. There we go. Now, we changed a needle, we picked a different stitch, we have a piece of fabric, which is a piece of basic stabilizer on the back. Let's see if we can make it pretty. I'm still using that Quilter Select very thin thread. Now, I could use a much thicker thread for this as well, but let's see how this looks. I got threads everywhere. I think I can go a little bit faster on this one, because the machine's doing all the work. Would you look at how pretty that is? Look at that big hole that it made in the center and the smaller holes that went around the outside edge. Now I used a very thin thread in this. Can you imagine this with an embroidery thread? This would be a really pretty stitch to put on an existing blouse that you may have. You can do some practice in an area, but if you want to take a basic like linen or cotton blouse and make some stitches down the front of it to make it a little bit fancier, this stitch would go really, really well. Now there's another stitch, 308. Let's see what that one like. We're out of time. So I'm going to go over and I'm going to go to 308. I didn't make any changes to that at all. Here we go. Let's lower the boom and see what we get. Remember, the stitch is going to stitch a little bit slower than you're used to because it's going to each one of those holes a couple times. That looks a little different, but that's kind of pretty. Now, I think I might want to do this in a little bit more matching thread, so I just get the effect of the holes coming on down. Or I could put this on either side of that lace that I did. Wouldn't that be pretty? I could take the lace piece and put this stitching on either side of it, and it would take that lace and make it a little extra wide. That's pretty fancy. So, do you agree? You can get some fancy for not that much effort. I think maybe we need to spin the wheel of fancy for one last time. Okay, here we go. So we've used a wing needle and we have used another foot. We've used that cording foot. But we're going to combine the two this time and do a twin needle and a pin tuck foot, because we're going to make some fun pin tucks. So I have some extra threads right here. Let me show you all the extra fun stuff that we can use. So here's my pin tuck foot. And I can use a regular foot for this. Don't be thinking that you have to get a pin tuck foot, but I think you'll see that you can use it for some pretty cool stuff pretty soon. So here's my pin tuck foot, and I am going to be using a twin needle. Where's my twin needle? Here it is. This twin needle happens to be a 1.6/70. What the heck does that mean? That means that the distance between the two needles is 1.6 millimeters, and that each of the needles is a size 70 needle. Now you can get twin needles, triple needles, you can get them in all kind of configurations, and there's a lot of different uses for twin needles. You could even get these as metallica, for using metallic threads inside them. So these are 2.5 millimeters apart, and these are size 80 needles. Tons of different combinations of twin needles. For a twin needle, what you are going to need is 2 threads on the top of the machine. So when we thread up the machine here in just a little bit, what we're going to do is we're going to rethread it and have 2 threads on the top. Now, what if you have just one spool of thread? Well, what you can do, and what I have done, is I've taken and wound 2 bobbins with the same thread. So when we thread up the machine, we're going to put both of these bobbins in the top, and that's how we're going to have 2 threads coming in. Just one bobbin thread, but we need 2 threads coming over the top. So now let's set up the machine where we're going to rethread the machine, and we're going to stitch this out. We're going to put on our twin needle, we're going to put on our pin tuck foot, but let's go ahead and let's just rethread the machine. Now, I have my 2 bobbins right here. I'm going to take out my spool of Quilter Select. And I'm going to put both of my bobbins on the top of the machine. And both of my threads are coming out. Now they're going to thread identically till they get to the top of the needle. So I'm going to come here and here, and they're going to commingle as they come on down. Now we're ready to thread our needle, but we need to put the needle in. So let's take out that wing needle and put in our twin needle. The twin needles come on a single shaft, and it goes in just like a regular needle does. Hold on. Tighten it on down. You want to make sure that shaft goes all the way to the very top. Tighten your needle on in. Now I'm going to use the same trick I did getting those needles threaded in, and I'm very nearsighted, so I'm taking off my glasses this time so I can get those threads in. They both get caught on this little catch right above the needle. Every machine has that. I'm going to put one in one side and one in the other. And now let's just snap on our foot. Now, I want to make sure that I'm not doing a wide decorative stitch with this. Can you see me now? Because I have that other stitch on there before. I'm just going to go with a straight stitch with my twin needle. Now you can do a decorative stitch with a twin needle, but you need to be careful. I talk about that in the handout. You don't want it to stitch too far on either side. We're just going to use a straight stitch for our pin tucks, but you can do a decorative stitch. Just be very careful. Let's grab our fabric. And I am using the straight stitch, but I want to increase the top tension on the thread. We had it at 9.0 before. We're not going to go that high this time. So I'm going to come into my settings and I'm going to increase it to what worked for me before was 6.8. I'm going to put the fabric under the presser foot, and the twin needle is going to do all the work. It's going to give me 2 rows side by side. Because I increase that top tension, it's going to suck that thread in just a little bit. Looks pretty good. It pulled that fabric up into a nice ridge. Now if I want to do additional stitching, I have grooves on the underside of that pintuck foot so I can make my stitching even. Here's the grooves, and I can simply ride that pintuck in one of those grooves, or I could use the side of the foot to get me a good distance. I'm going to ride it in this groove right here and see what I get. I can get evenly spaced pintucks and they look pretty cool. But there's a way to make it so that your pintuck is a little bit more something. And if your fabric is sheer, you can get a little extra color in there too. So let's make a corded pintuck. Now a corded pintuck, I'm going to use that thicker thread again, just like I used before. I'm doing the cord on the edge, and I'm using a bright red so that you can see it. But imagine if this fabric was a very sheer white batiste. This red would show through in that pintuck. And, oh my gosh, it would be really cool to have that red showing up through there, and it would give me just a hint of color. Now, I have this pintuck foot, and I hope you can see, the center of the pintuck foot, let me get so I can show you, has this little groove right here. Now the needles are set up here to this one side. Now I can move the needle so that I can use that groove to hold my thread. As you guessed it, I have that amazing left-right shift to do that. So I'm going to go back to my settings on the screen, and I'm going to use my left-right shift to move my needle over to the right. The neat thing about the left-right shift is the needle position moves at 1/2 millimeter. Left-right shift works in 1/4 millimeter. So it works with a thread worth of fabric. And I can see that I need to go a little bit more. And now those 2 needles are coming right over the top of that little groove in that foot. Now, this is the fussiest of all the fancy stitches that I'm going to show you, because you kind of have to get it in the right spot, and you can't see that cord when you're doing it. So let's see if we can figure this out. So there's my cord. It's going to go right down through the middle, and I'm going to take my piece of fabric and I'm going to lay it over the top. I'm going to give myself extra cord in the front, lay it on down, and I'm going to feel if that cord is right in that groove. And I can just barely see it. I don't think that you can, but I can feel the cord and I can kind of see that ridge underneath the fabric. Now all I have to do is stitch just like I did before. Oops. Let's see if I did it. Well, it looks pretty good on the top, and it looks really good on the back. So, I hope you can see that you can really make that ridge really, really pronounced. And if you have a sheer fabric, you can do a little bit of shadow play there as well. Now you can get an accessory for the machine. Let me grab it. I know I have it over here. You can get a new bobbin cover that is that feeds through, that'll hold that in place. And so the thicker thread cord would go through here and come out there, and that puts it in the right position for stitching over the top of it. It's an optional accessory, but it can really make it easier if you're going to do tons and tons and tons. So I don't know how much time we've been. How much time have we been, cameraman? Okay, well, I think we've done quite a bit of fancy. I'd like you to go ahead and look into your handout. All the settings are here for this. We covered a lot of territory. Just pick something fancy and try it, because, you know, Life's too short for just plain sewing. I'm going to shoot it over to George. Thanks for sticking with me today. I hope you enjoyed a lot of a little bit of fancy. Take care. Take it away, George.
Thanks, Cathy. Once again, that was a great presentation. Don't forget to click on the link to download Cathy's guide on that incredible project. Now, every once in a while, a machine's introduced to the industry that really offers high performance at a great value, and that's the Baby Lock Vesta. Not only is it a great sewing and quilting machine, but it also is an incredible embroidery machine. The embroidery features include a hoop that's larger than 10 by 6, and it has a wonderful color touchscreen. And look at this beautiful embroidery. Plus it removes the jump stitches, and it even has a special software program that sends your design via Wi-Fi right to the machine. Now, that's not all though. For a sewing machine, it has the automatic fabric sensor that senses fabric from heavy denim to sheer fabric to working with elastic or even a ribbing on a collar like a t-shirt knit. But quilting features, it actually will sew in different directions. We have some designs that are incredible for going down the sashing border. It has an automatic 1/4 inch so you can do your piecing, plus all kinds of wonderful decorative stitches. So as you see, this is an incredible sewing, quilting, and embroidery machine. Now, we have a very special buy on this machine. This machine has a manufacturer suggested list price of $59.99. But right now, it's on sale for $39.99, and we're including free shipping across the country, as well as interest-free financing is available. I want to make a very special offer for those who are watching Sewing Tech Talk with Cathy, and that is with a mystery bonus. Why is it a mystery bonus? Well, I don't have a lot of them, but I want to make sure those who are contacting me, all you have to do is mention Cathy, our Sewing Tech Talk with Cathy, and I have this bonus value that is incredible. So give us a call at 1-800-865-9664 and discover how easy it is to get an incredible sewing, quilting, and embroidery machine. Bye for now.